Amelion's quiet life was turned upside down the instant he answered a police call on a misty morning. Nobody had heard from Lucien, his son, for days. He was missing. Early in his 20s, Lucien was a vibrant and aspirational young man, employed as a data analyst for a reputable tech company. Though Amelion hadn't seen him in a week, this was not unusual. Given Lucien had lately relocated into a small apartment in downtown to be closer to his workplace, Amelion was bothered by the way Lucien's wife, Nia, appeared especially nervous since Lucien vanished. Younger than Amelion by more than a decade, Nia was a quiet woman who had married Amelion 3 years ago. The fact that Nia's behavior had lately become erratic deepened Amelion's worries, even though he couldn't exactly identify the cause. Friends, sorry to interrupt, but please help me reach 2,000 subscribers by the end of the summer. Let's keep going. Examining Lucien's disappearance, the police looked at his social circle, work patterns, and any possible problems he might have had. The research seemed to stop until a pivotal finding was made. Amelion was not ready for what would follow. Police monitoring and audio recording revealed Nia's phone calls weeks later, which had become unusually covert since Lucien vanished. Though her talks were evasive, there was enough hidden in the cryptic whispers to suggest something much darker than anyone had first thought. As the probe developed, researchers concentrated on Nia and Amelion's house. Few days after Lucien vanished, a neighbor had seen Nia late at night loading something heavy into her car. The cops then started to think she might be hiding something. The discovery came when the police chose to employ sophisticated audio surveillance tools, enabling the capture of talks they never would have otherwise come across. Recording a terrible conversation between Nia and an unidentified man. This technology tracked and recorded minute sound variations from a distance. Lucien was mentioned. There were hints of guilt and admissions that chilled everyone engaged. Detectives soon started closely examining Nia, and following weeks of pressure, her calm front started to show cracks. Pressing her, the truth gradually came apart. Nia confessed in tears, revealing the terrible. She had been seeing her stepson, Lucien, an affair. Although the disclosure rocked the family, there was more. Lucien had not simply vanished. Nia admitted she had killed him. The specifics of the murder came out shockingly clearly. Nia owned that the affair had gotten out of hand. From a dangerous attraction between her and Lucien, what started out became something neither could control. Having seen each other in secret for more than a year, their relationship had become complex when Lucien started urging Nia to leave Amelion. Desperate to keep the affair secret, and fearing Lucien would reveal their relationship, she made the decision to call it quits all around. Nia acted out of fear and wrath one night, following a furious dispute, whereby Lucien threatened to tell Amelion everything. She drew Lucien to a remote location where she bludgeoned him dead with a blunt object. Though they had not yet located Lucien's body, the investigation team was horrified by the account. Nia had concealed it deftly. After several weeks of inquiry, the police used their most advanced tools. Audio surveillance. A painstaking search followed. Based on background sounds, they found a rural area where they thought the body might be buried after listening over the recordings. Following these hints, they discovered Lucien's remains, buried under layers of dirt and leaves in a deep forest, after a tortie search. Nia was taken into custody. The narrative went all over the media. Her desperate attempt to hide it all, the shocking affair with her stepson, and the terrible and unsettling picture painted by the brutal murder, all pointed to, still unresolved though, were certain questions. What had motivated Nia up to now? For what length of time had she kept such a terrible secret? Though some closure was offered by the discovery of Lucien's body, the inquiry of Nia's life, motivations, and the unseen dynamics of their relationships had only just started. Amelion was caught in a whirlpool of incredulity and horror following Nia's startling admission. Along with betraying him with her own son, the woman he had loved, married, and shared a life with had also taken his life, cold-blooded. The detectives kept delving deeper into Nia's life, and what they found about her and Lucian's affair rocked the case and added even more drama to the already remarkable crime. Nia's subdued manner had always seemed a bit of a puzzle. Working for a pharmaceutical company, she was a quiet woman, always focused on her studies and career as a research biologist. The couple had crossed paths at a charitable event, where eminent surgeon Amelion was the main speaker. At the time, she had seemed young and idealistic, enthralled by his experience and wisdom, though to outsiders it seemed natural. The marriage had become frigid over the past year, as Amelion spent more time at work and Nia grew more detached. Now, investigators thought Nia had been driven into Lucian's arms by this emotional gulf. Though Lucian had always been charming, the kind of person who drew people naturally, his relationship with his father had been strained for years. Lucian had objected, since Amelion had always had great expectations for his son and pushed him mercilessly toward success. Though that need had started to fade once Nia entered the picture, Lucian still sought his father's approval, despite the strains between them. The affair between the two began innocuously enough. Shared moments of conversation when Amelion was away for his long shifts, casual looks that soon became far more dangerous. It was too late to reverse the harm, though, by the time Lucian and Nia understood the depths of their connection. More specifics on Lucian and Nia's relationship surfaced during the research. After looking through Lucian's phone, which had been discovered at his apartment, detectives found a wealth of messages between him and Nia. Secrets, passion, and finally desperation abound in the books. Lucian had grown more forceful on Nia, leaving Amelion, and demanding that their relationship be made public as the affair progressed. Nia, though, had become more and more paranoid, since she knew the truth would ruin her whole life. Lucian had threatened to tell his father since he thought Amelion would finally embrace their relationship. But Nia knew better. Amelion would never pardon such a betrayal. Nia's social media accounts provided among the more damning bits of proof. For all his shortcomings, Lucian had become reckless. Though investigators discovered hints of secret meetings between the two in private messages, the hidden pictures were the real messmaker in the affair. Under the cover of Lucian's business travel, these were personal images of Nia and Lucian, taken in locations Amelion had never even visited, little weekend getaways they had shared. Particularly during the days before Lucian's murder, the phone records revealed long, late-night calls between the two. The records clearly showed their relationship disintegrating, Lucian growing more irate, and Nia feeling imprisoned by her situation. The forensic look verified Nia's involvement in the murder even more. Blood traces were discovered in her car's trunk, and a little secret compartment in their shared garage held Lucian's wallet and some of his personal items, haphazardly thrown away. Still, the most startling revelation came from looking over the night Lucian vanished surveillance footage. With what looked to be a tarp-covered object in the back seat of her car, Nia was leaving the house in the middle of the night, captured on a neighbor's security camera. Still, psychological rather than physical was the most telling clue. After the crime, Nia's behavior exposed a convoluted network of guilt, denial, and desperation. She had started to break down long before her confession. But the phone's surveillance footage gave the police mental clarity. She had repeated calls to a close friend, each one more nervous and erratic. "I made a horrible mistake," she said softly on one of the calls. Her talks were tinged with anxiety about discovery, but also a weird disengagement from what she had done, as though she hadn't really absorbed the weight of her acts. The media frenzy grew along with the deepening probe. Front-page news was the tale of the surgeon's wife, who had killed her son in a fit of guilt and desperation. Both true crime aficionados and reporters examined every element, hypothesizing about what had motivated Nia to reach such a horrific end. Some presented her as a victim of circumstance, a woman caught in a poisonous affair she was unable to break off. Others described her as a cold, deliberate woman who had given all to hide her illegal relationship. To Amelion, the truth was more difficult to swallow. The affair between his son and wife broke not only his family, but also his identity. He had been too blind, too focused on his work to see the odd, progressively close relationship Nia had with Lucien, or the widening gulf separating him from her. The affair complicated his grief for his son. He couldn't forgive Lucien for betraying him or clear himself for not seeing the warning signals. Now everyone was focused on the trial, where Nia's future would be decided. But in the darkness of the courtroom, a more important question hung. Was Nia really the genius, or had Lucien's influence dominated the tragedy more than anyone had thought? The trial would shortly expose the secret realities underlying the falsehoods. Nia was on trial for the murder of her stepson, Lucien, and the packed courtroom was charged with obvious conflict. The scandal of the decade had already been the tale of a wife caught in a forbidden affair with her husband's son. The trial promised to expose even more startling facts. Amelion sat in the front row, his face a mask of grief and mistrust, unable to reconcile the woman he had loved with the monster, now accused of murder. The facts were bad, as the prosecution presented its case. The mountain of digital records, Nia's confession, and the physical evidence all pointed to one thing. She had drawn Lucien to his death in an effort to hide the secret affair already starting to fall apart. Her car's blood, the letters she sent to Lucien, and the neighbor witness testimony combined to create an airtight story that presented Nia as both a lover and a killer. The prosecution walked the jury through the affair methodically. They told how Nia, dissatisfied in her marriage to Amelion, had turned to younger, more focused friend, Lucien, for solace. The affair had spiraled out of control and resulted in threats and continual strife. Lucien snapped when he urged Nia to leave Amelion and reveal their relationship. She chose to quiet him permanently in that desperate moment. The court also heard from colleagues and friends of Lucien, many of whom had observed unusual changes in his behavior in the months before his death. He was unhappy at home and had even confided in one close friend he was in love with someone he couldn't be with. He had grown secretive, withdrawn, and frequently spoke in cryptic terms about being trapped. Everyone in the courtroom could clearly see that Lucien had suffered as much from this affair as Nia had. The defense, meanwhile, was not about to let the prosecution shape the story. Lucien had manipulated Nia, according to her lawyers, had been fixated on her, and had behaved out of fear. Pointing to text messages in which Lucien had threatened to reveal their affair should she not leave Amelion. They said Lucien was a volatile and dangerous presence in her life. The defense presented a picture of a woman driven to a breaking point after being cornered by her lover, pushed into an impossible situation. The defense calling a psychological expert to testify on Nia's mental state marked one of the most pivotal events in the trial. The expert said that Nia had been experiencing extreme psychological and emotional suffering prior to the murder. They maintained that she had been driven by fear and desperation instead of malice or cold calculation, so losing her right mind when she killed Lucien. Insisting that Nia had been under the undue influence of Lucien's manipulative actions, the defense argued for forgiveness. Amelion sat silently throughout the trial, digesting the specifics of the relationship that had rocked his family. He listened as the defense maintained Lucien had been the aggressor, unable to let go of his fixation on Nia. Then he also heard the prosecution offer another narrative. Nia had deftly portrayed both father and son, controlling each to satisfy her own needs. It became abundantly evident as the trial went on that this was a fight of perception rather than only a murder case. Was Nia a cold-blooded killer whose death had been carefully scheduled to conceal her secret? Alternatively, was she driven to act violently in a desperate moment by Lucien's possessive love? Both stories battled for control of the courtroom, leaving the jury to determine the actual Nia. The pivotal point arrived when Nia stood up herself. She told tearfully how the affair had started, first innocent, then spiraling out of control. She talked of Lucien's increasingly erratic behavior and of his threat to ruin her life, should she refuse to leave Amelion. Nia presented herself as someone caught in a web of lies, too scared to be honest, and too damaged to know how out from here. She said the murder was a crime of passion, carried out in a flash of pure terror when Lucien had turned violent during one of their last meetings. It had not been planned. But cross-examination from the prosecution ripped apart her account. They noted her attempts to cover up the crime by cleaning the blood from her car and deleting messages from her phone, as well as discrepancies in her chronology, and questioned why she had buried Lucien's body if it had been an accident. The prosecution claimed that these were the acts of a calculated killer, trying to hide her tracks, not of a terrified woman. Days of jury deliberation, the weight of the case clear in their long debates. Media, relatives, and even the general public were divided. Some saw Nia as a tragic figure, while others saw her as a dangerous woman who had engaged in a lethal game with her own family. The room was clearly tense when the decision was eventually declared. As the jury's foreman read the words deciding her fate, guilty of first-degree murder, Nia stood pale and shaking. Gasps and whispers erupted in the courtroom as the judge sentenced her to life in prison without any chance of parole. For Amelion, the decision was mixed. Though it wouldn't undo the harm, justice had been done. The family he knew vanished permanently. His son was dead, his wife a killer. Although everyone engaged suffered, the truth had at last been exposed regardless of how sinister. Amelion now had the slow, difficult chore of reconstructing a life from the ruins left behind by treachery, murder, and dishonesty. The media storm around the case started to fade as Nia behind bars, and the trial came to end. For Amelion, however, the end of the trial signaled the start of a new chapter marked by loss, loneliness, and the search for meaning in a life totally destroyed. Though Amelion had been too numb with shock and disbelief to really grieve his son at the time, Lucien's funeral had been scheduled months before the trial. Now, in the still aftermath, the truth of what had happened assaulted him squarely. The woman the man had loved and trusted had killed his kid. Though the affair had been shocking enough, the terrible way it had all ended still tormented him. Over and over he went back in his mind, looking for some moment when he could have seen the warning signals, some clue that would have cautioned him before it was too late. Amelion withdraws from everyone for weeks following the trial. His once active house was now an empty shell, memories he could not flee, filling every corner, while Nia's presence seemed to linger like a ghost in every aspect of the house. Lucien's room stayed unaltered, a terrible reminder of the son he had lost. Haunted by the betrayal that had occurred within his own walls, he couldn't bring himself to stay in their bedroom, and instead most nights he sleeps on the couch. Amelion's loss gradually changed as the weeks grew into months, into something darker: guilt. He couldn't help but question whether he had some bearing on what had happened. He had missed what was right in front of him after spending so much time at work, striving excellence and reputation as a surgeon. Emotionally detached and ignorant of the mounting conflict between his son and wife, was Lucien pushed into Nia's arms by his absence? Was his neglect the reason such a twisted relationship could have developed? When Amelion went back over the talks he had once had with Lucien, his self-blame grew stronger. Years of conflict between them had been building, especially since Amelion had set such high standards for his son. Lucien had always bucked the pressure to follow in his father's footsteps, choosing a tech career instead of medicine. Their relationship was now tense and rife with unspoken resentment and misinterpretation. Looking back, Amelion wondered whether their broken bond had driven Lucien to turn to Nia for comfort, so producing a relationship that ought never to have existed. Amelion found times of wrath toward his son, despite these agonizing thoughts. Deeply betrayed. How could Lucien have done this to him? How could he have veered so far? Lucien and Nia's affair was more than just infidelity. It was a betrayal of their family bond, a breach of trust so great it seemed permanent even in death. Amelion was caught between grief for his son and resentment of the decisions Lucien had taken. He was oscillating between sadness and rage. Amelion started to dig the layers of his guilt and loss in therapy as time went on. His therapist guided him toward forgiveness of himself, even though he couldn't control the decisions Nia and Lucien had made. Yes, he had been a poor husband and father, but he had not started the affair or the murder. Amelion started to let go of the weight he had been dragging. Slowly, therapy turned into a lifeline for him, providing a forum for trauma processing and loss acceptance in ways he hadn't let himself. The world moved on outside the still walls of his house. Many felt closure from Nia's incarceration, but it also left scars that would never completely heal. Although the media coverage had stopped, true crime forums and documentaries still carried the tale of the surgeon, his murdered son, and her dark secret. While some saw Nia as a woman driven to desperation by unworkable circumstances, others considered her life sentence as the ultimate justice. For Amelion, however, no public discussion could ever alter the personal reality he lived. He had lost his wife and son, and nothing could ever bring them back. Amelion sold the house that had been the backdrop for so much suffering finally, as the months passed. It was too full of ghosts, too tarnished by the memories of what had happened inside its boundaries. Moving to a smaller apartment on the outskirts of the city, he hoped the change of surroundings would provide some degree of peace. The emotional scars persisted even if the physical relocation had minor benefits. Amelion started to reconstruct his life, bit by bit over time. Reaching out to former friends, he threw himself back into his work, and even found solace in volunteer work, where he coached young people dealing with trauma and loss. His efforts in the operating room evolved from a job to a healing tool. Every life he preserved on the operating table served as a reminder that even though he was unable to save his son, he could yet make positive changes in the world. Though Amelion learned to live with the weight of it, Lucien and Nia stayed always in the backdrop. Though there was acceptance, there was no perfect resolution or last moment of peace that would wipe off the hurt of what had happened. Though he would never forget, he had learnt to live forward. Amelion discovered at last a peculiar kind of redemption, not in forgetting the past, but in facing it and letting himself be human. Though he had been a victim of unspeakable treachery, he had survived. Thus, that triumph was inherent. He came to see as the years went by that although life would never be the same, it could still be lived, and that was sufficient. Years following the disaster, Amelion silently stood by Lucien's tomb, a basic headstone designating the location of his son's resting place. Though time had dulled the acuity of the suffering, the weight of loss persisted. The betrayal had changed from consuming him to a deep, constant gloom, a friend he had learnt to carry without being crushed by it. Nia stayed in jail, her life frozen in a cell, while Amelion had progressed in his own manner. Having realized the chapter they had written was closed, he stopped visiting her. Though he would never completely know why things had turned out the way they had, he had come to peace and stopped needing to. Once tormented him, the questions lost their hold. Not by forgetting. He had found his way through the darkness, by forgiving himself and deciding to live once more. Amelion let himself one last glance at Lucien's tomb as he was leaving the cemetery. The wind murmured among the trees, and for the first time in years, he experienced something like closure. Not an end, but rather a fresh start. Life, brittle and imperfect, persisted as would he.